All right, looks like we're recording here. I have Professor Joseph A.P. Wilson with us at MythVision. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me again. It's always a pleasure, Derek.
Yeah, I love interviewing you. You're really well spoken and you say what you mean and it makes sense. It's easy to understand. So viewers will get what you're saying today. Just to introduce you again to those who may not have seen our previous interviews, Joseph Wilson is a broadly trained archaeologist and a lecturer in the Department of Classics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He earned a doctorate from the University of Florida and a master's degrees from Michigan Technological University and the University of London, School of Oriental and African Studies. His research addresses long-distance cultural exchanges in ancient Eurasia through the analysis of material culture, technology, and religion. Welcome back, my friend.
Thanks for having me.
So you're going to be proving the validity of the ancient Eastern religions today. I'm actually, so what are we doing today? What do you have for us?
So we were chatting with a group of us that are your scholarly friends. We're chatting about the whole undesigned coincidences thing. And you were saying, do you have any notions of some undesigned coincidences you could talk about? And I think this is a good example. I'm going to share with you a good example of an undesigned coincidence, or just a coincidence is probably a better way to say, because all real coincidences are undesigned, in my opinion. This is an interesting thing that pops up in a medieval manuscript that points back to a historical fact from about 1,000 years earlier. And I want to set the bar really high for what we consider to be an undesigned coincidence. And so I'm going to present this one, and we're going to kind of go around the barn a little bit to get there, but hopefully at the end you'll see where I'm coming from. So to contrast this with the use of the term undesigned coincidences by religious apologists, where they're talking about closely related literatures where you can't really call it coincidental. So where the very use of the word coincidence is problematic. That makes sense.
100% amen to that. I'm on your side here. And I've said this before. If it was a coincidence, you can't know that it was when you know there's design happening. So
exactly. The designing of a coincidence makes it not a coincidence. It makes it an intentional plot point in your narrative. Yeah.
And it's obvious these are narratives, but
like retconning, that kind of thing. You're taking a new installment in a franchise and making it fit with the older installments. So
right. Well, let's get into this. I'm excited to see what you present.
All right, thank you.
Do I need to bring up the PowerPoint?
If you would want to bring up the PowerPoint, you can. So my presentation here is on the early shramana movements, which originate in India around 2,500 years ago. And after Alexander the Great's conquest of parts of what was then northern India, what's modern Afghanistan and Pakistan, that after he conquered those regions, there was some degree of influence, some amount of Indian philosophy and religious knowledge made it back through the Greek world and was preserved in various literatures down to the medieval period and illuminated manuscripts that were recorded by Christians, Jews, and Muslims. And so I want to talk about the echoes of authentic shramana religious practices in late medieval manuscript, in one late medieval manuscript in particular. So we're going to just do a really quick rundown of what the shramana religions are. The two most famous shramana religions, one of them is Buddhism. So the Buddha was a member of a shramana sect, and the other one is Jainism. Mahavira, the founder of the religion of Jainism, which is closely related to Buddhism, that's the other surviving shramana religion. So there are two religions that still exist today and have lots of practitioners in the current era. These were the religions that were countercultural with respect to the normal state religion of ancient India, which we call Brahmanism at that stage, or Brahmanical polytheism. So like the ancestor to Hinduism. it's called Hinduism in like the medieval period, but back then it would have been Vedic polytheism. So like the Rig Vedas are the Hindu Old Testament, if you will, the earliest like writings in Sanskrit that are pertaining to the polytheism of the Indian subcontinent. Well, the shramana movements were monastic movements that arose in opposition to the hereditary priesthood of the Brahmanas. And in ancient classical Western sources, like in Greco-Roman sources, they talked about the religion of India as being made up of two religions, the Brahmanas and the Shramanas, right? So they would say Indians practice one of two faiths, Brahmana or Shramana. So you can think of the early Shramana movements as more like denominations of one movement, of which Buddhism and Jainism are now distinct religions that survive. Okay, so you can advance to the next slide. The statue in the first slide was the Mahavira and the Buddha. You can see their similar iconography, right? The way that they're portrayed and everything. It all goes back to the same sort of art style and everything. Okay, go on. So essentially what you have is a large vocabulary, religious vocabulary that's shared across various Shramana movements. So, and this shows again that they're more like denominations of a larger movement. So they have the name Shramana is generally means monk, right? To be a Shramana is like a striving monk who's trying to perfect himself, or herself. A nun would be the woman version, right? Samsara is this concept in Indian religion of the endless cycle of birth and death as we reincarnate and reincarnate again. And in the Shramana movements, it's bad. You don't think of the endless reincarnation as being a worthy goal. It's not like you want to live because you keep suffering and dying over and over again and forgetting and doing it and then forgetting. And in other words, samsara is eternal suffering, the constant rebirth and death. And so the object of the Shramana meditation, ascetic practice, is to break the wheel of samsara and to enter to enter nirvana, which is the cessation, the ultimate triumph over death. That means that you don't do it anymore and you become undifferentiated from the cosmos in some way. How the specifics depends on your sect, right? They're not all the same. But the terminology that the Shramana movements used was quite consistent. So like when the Buddha becomes enlightened, the other people who see him become enlightened, they can follow him into nirvana. And they're arhats or arhats, right? Depending on the dialect. And they are the enlightened disciples. Like the Buddha's Peter and Simon, like the 12 apostles in Christianity, only with him, his people were able to enter nirvana with him. And whereas the later monks have to like work a lot harder because they don't have like the dude himself to take him there.
Right.
They also popularized the notion of karma as a moral law where you will cause and effect. That's the sort of way we think of karma now. That really comes from the Shramana movements originally. The early Vedic texts have karma in them, but they mean it more like ritual obligation, like the duty of the priest. So like the earliest use of karma in the ancestor of Hinduism doesn't have the same sort of notion of like, when I sin, I face consequences. When I do good, I get rewards. That notion. So like the technical way that we think of karma functioning in Indian religion, that's a product of the Shramana movements. Also dharma as moral law, like preaching the law of Buddhism, the Sangha, the monastic community, even the titles, the honorific titles that we use for these people, they could have been used by members of the different sects. So what do I mean by that? If you are a Jain, a follower of Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, you say, Mahavira, you are a Buddha, because a Buddha is an awakened one, right? So the word Buddha is a title. And when we say Buddha, we think the historical Buddha who founded Buddhism, Siddhartha Gautama, but he's also in some sense a Jina, a victor over death, right? So in other words, they use the same titles for their leaders, and they have the same name for scriptures, sutras, which are their gospels, if you will. And they also involve the same Hindu gods as foils, like, so Brahma and Indra are not real. They are God. They're like real moral guides, but they don't have ultimate reality. They're like figments. They're there to, they hope that the shramana leaders, they say, Buddha, you're the only one who can save people. We can't. So they plead with him to not enter nirvana too soon, because he has the capacity to rescue, to liberate suffering humanity, where gods can only can only show how to be a good person, which isn't good enough, which doesn't get you there, right? So you see both Jain and Buddhist scriptures where Brahma, the creator god, and Indra, the king of heaven, are like, less than the human leaders of their own sects. They're less important. So you see this pattern across various shramana movements. Again, the only two that survive are Buddhism and Jainism, but they were linked early on. The Buddha was probably originally one of the Jain leader Mahavira's disciples, and then he ultimately broke away from the movement that gives you Jainism, and because he thought it was too extreme in certain ways. So they're like, Jains are more moderate in some of their metaphysical beliefs than Buddhists, but they're more radical in terms of their practices. Their asceticism is more extreme, right? Whereas the Buddhism is the middle path. It's a more moderate form of the shramana practice, where it says you wear clothing.
This reminds me of Jesus coming in and going, look, come on, your animal falls on a Sabbath. It reminds me in a way on.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. So and also the tension, you see the similar tensions between Brahmanism and shamanism and Shramanism. You see between the Christianity and the earlier forms of rabbinical or proto-rabbinical Judaism that the Nazarene sect are struggling against, like in Luke, where you get the tension between family obligations and going and serving Jesus, right? The Shramanas were world renouncers. So they were people who were abandoning their families to go and live at the monastic, to go follow the religious life, right? So you have that very analogous, like, where this new movement is like flaunting the social obligations that are associated with the ethnic religion, in India. All right, so but we're going to move on because we got to get to our example here.
Did you want me to go to the next one? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. So those are just a list of many. So just to reveal how much Buddhism and Jainism have in common. They're very, very, very closely related at the point of origin 2,500 years ago. And again, both of these traditions, they didn't write down their sutras for like hundreds of years. We think of it, you people are skeptical because the Jesus movement didn't start writing the biographies of the founder until decades later, and so we're like all skeptical of that. In the case of the South Asian religions, the biographies of the founders weren't written until centuries later. So there was a long, long period when the monastic orders used rote memorization. They had they had the different sections of what eventually became the canon of scripture. There were like monks in charge of like reciting the oral history of the religion, and then eventually they said, "Oh, this is getting really old. We need to start writing it down." But what I'm going to say though is that at the time that Alexander the Great, in the 3rd century BC, the time that Alexander the Great shows up, we're still in that early period of the shramana movements. So now we're a century or two after these guys are dead. So it's their 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th generation disciples, but they haven't got to the point where they're scripturally codified yet, right? So they're still in this sort of nebulous. The shramana movements are, so that's why the Greeks talk about the fact that there's brahmanas and shramanas. They didn't say there's Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, etc., because they hadn't developed that sort of clear demarcation.
Kind of like early Christianity, that there's muddling of various gospels and texts and beliefs, but eventually they nail it down with an orthodox position in a way that divides the different groups in a way.
Yeah, I think you said you cut out for a brief moment there. Hopefully you got the recording on your end. From what I heard, I think I agree with what you just said.
Yeah, just the only difference is the apologist will say, "Look at how much sooner they wrote about the Jesus and not
right." Yeah,
leg up they had.
That's fine. Yeah, but I'm not here to apologize for any religion. I'm just here to talk about the historical contours of this particular thing. So,
got it.
So they're written down later. So let's now go back in time and talk about the fact that there were actually 3 extinct sects of the Shramana movement that were at the time equal to Buddhists and Jains, right? So Buddhists and Jains were major and they survived to the present. But if you go back 500 years before Christ, they were just one of about 5 total different major schools within their own movement. Mm-hmm. And so let's talk about the Greeks came when they were. And they didn't necessarily encounter Buddhists as we know them or Jains as we know them. They might have encountered shramana leaders and shramana sects that were representatives of the other now extinct forms of this like countercultural religious thing. And they form a huge spectrum with like hedonism at one end and extreme asceticism at the other end. Think about like the 60s counterculture in the United States.
Right.
You had like some people doing orgies and some people doing like Orthodox Hindu, like extreme vegetarianism and celibacy, right? So you had, and some people who believed in very, very strict theological stuff, and some people who were absolutely radically atheists, right? You had in the Shramana movement, the entire spectrum that we're talking about here. There were some sort of theistic Shramanas maybe, but for the most part, they were much more non-theistic and atheistic than Brahmanical religion was at the time. So if you were like experimenting with atheism, you'd probably be a member of one of these Shramana sects if you were from India at that, in that stage. Okay. Oh, but here's a problem. Most of our surviving references to the extinct ones comes through their rival texts. Right? And like Buddhism and Jainism in particular caricature their opponent. Why should you be a member of my group and not theirs? Because they're, this nasty thing and that nasty thing. So that the beginning of the distortion of our picture comes from the fact that the surviving sects are where we get the most detailed written accounts of the sects that don't survive, which are the ones that are the bad ones, or according to the good ones, right? Okay, so let's quickly go over the 3 Shramana sects that no longer exist. Next slide.
And by the way, just one note.
Yeah.
The same problem we have technically with Orthodox Christianity writing in
heresies.
Caricature.
Yeah, that's right. Whether you're talking about Manichaeans or Marcionites or various flavors of Gnosticism or, Arians or you name, the followers of various, there are numerous examples of the religions that get rejected becoming caricatured, turned into kind of like cartoonish exaggerations of their actual, like much more like mundane reality. Okay, so let's talk about the 3, and again, these are the only ones we know of. We know that there were 5 different Shramana sects, and 3 of them we know are now extinct. There may have been others too. So the Lokayatas were one, and most of them were nudists. At least the male practitioners were. Buddhism rejected the clothing optional monastic lifestyle, and so they were more like moderate or even conservative when it came to dress, whereas their other competing Shramana movements were all about like shedding attachments, like the Jedi, no attachments. So shedding attachments means you cut off your beautiful hair, you throw away your beautiful robes, and you just have your begging bowl, and you go and you sit in the forest, and you let the enlightenment approach you. Okay, so most of them were probably naked philosopher ascetics, and several of the groups were rather radically atheist. Some of them were more moderate, like agnostic. Like we think that the Gymnosophists may have been agnostic. The Ajivikas and the Lokayatas were both atheistic. So the Lokayatas were hedonists who believed in like sense pleasure first and foremost, And that was one of the early shramana movements that lasts down through the period of the formation of the other ones. And they're one of the ones that gets rejected by the others, right, before their hedonism. Like Buddhism says that you don't get enlightenment by giving into your like desire to like have, get high and orgasm. Like it's not the point of your existence. But the Alokiatas were also nudists and atheistic. The Ajivikas are interesting because they were like atheist Calvinists. They believed in predestination, and they believed that that karma was pointless. They said there's no reason to worry about karma because it's all been decided in advance. And the only reason why we do this religious practice is so that we can, live a good life. Not because we expect anything to happen afterwards, so they did not believe in free will. That's really interesting. Wow. But they were one of the major shramana sects at the time. So they were probably one of the chief rivals to early Buddhism. Like the Buddhist movement was like trying to get off the ground, and they had to debate with their rivals in the movement. And then the one that's mentioned in the Greek sources. The one that we think that the caravans surrounding Alexander the Great encountered are the gymnosophists. And think that's like a Greek name, right? Think of it like as gymnastic sophists, right? These are physically disciplined, yoga practicing philosopher monks. And they are very similar to the Jains. They're like a slightly more radical form of Jainism. If you look at the practices of modern Jainism, they probably have the most in common with the gymnosophists in many ways. But just to clarify, Jains still practice nude asceticism, at least the southern Jains do. The Digambara sect, or the sky-clad monks of South India, the males don't wear clothing, and there are because it's not appropriate for women to do that. Sexism, there are no nuns in Digambara Jainism. You move into northern India where it's colder, those Jains are dominated by nuns, and they wear clothing because it's northern India, and you can't, you'd shiver if you weren't wearing clothes. And so the Mahavira of the Jains, he was also somewhat more moderate in the sense that he said clothing optional. He said he didn't mandate nudity. It wasn't like a requirement for Jain monasticism, whereas it was forbidden by Buddhists. It was optional for Jains, and for the others, it was pretty much mandatory. If you're going to join us, you're not wearing clothing. All right, so now we're moving on to go to the next slide. So here is an illustration from a Nepalese palm leaf manuscript. So this would be a Buddhist scripture from Nepal that shows the miracle at Shravasti, which is, how Jesus walks on water and Jesus divides the loaves. Buddhists also have, after Buddha's enlightenment, he also does like these miracles, these bodily miracles that cause people to say, wow, you must really be the Buddha. And in this case, he multiplies his form. He appears in more than one place at a time. And here he's doing it in a debate with all the other shramana leaders. And so what's he do? You see what the picture shows? He's now in 3 places at once. And what do the other shramana leaders, who are all these nude philosopher ascetics, including like Jains and gymnosophists, et cetera, and Ajivikas, what are they doing? They're like, whoa! And they're like doing backflips, and like he's completely blown their mind. And he's also wearing clothes, right? So how is he capable to do that when he doesn't, when he's not naked like us? Anyway, so this is just showing that nudity is not treated as a virtuous thing in the Buddhist tradition, and it's shown as one of like the things that we do better than you. But regardless, this is just illustrating that whole shramana spectrum exists in Buddhist literature as negative contrasts. The virtuousness of Buddhists versus the flaws of these other teachers.
Go next.
Yep. So let's get into the Greek accounts. So around the time of Alexander the Great, they're actually meeting up with real gymnosophists, real early shramana leaders. And there are a couple of indications of solid historical accounts from early on. There's a lost description written by Onesicratus and recorded partially in Strabo's geography, so which is available online. You can read it yourself. So about 6 or 7 sections of chapter 1 of book 15 are paraphrasing the account of Onesicratus, and you can see there's a little bit about the Brahmanas, and you can see some similarities to famous Indian practices like bride burning and various weird marital things that are talked about in relation to the Brahmanas. And then when they're talking about the Shramanas, they talk about extreme bodily mortification and nudity, and also generally ascetic, skeptical, cynical philosophy. So people for a long time thought Onesicratus was projecting Greek cynicism into the philosophy of these Indian gymnosophists. But recently, I think more people have been rejecting that idea and saying, no, actually, if anything, maybe Greek cynicism grew out of this contact, right? There's later Greek philosophical movements that might have been inspired by interaction with India and with these. So it goes two ways. It's not just like influence from one direction to the other.
Right.
All right. And so, yeah, Pyrrho of Elis is he has a kind of a radical skeptical philosophy that several people think is directly influenced by the contact between Alexander and Alexander's retinue and the Shramanas. It wasn't Alexander himself, although the later legends show Alexander himself meeting with the Shramana leaders, because the later legends are distortions. It was more like he sent Onesicratus, who is a philosopher general. So he's a military leader, but he's also a philosopher, and he's interested in learning from these Indian philosophers. And they don't go to people to missionize. They're doing their thing in their space, and they let it be known that they don't mind if you come and ask them questions, but they don't care if you're a freaking king, right, or emperor. There's nobody who's important enough that they would go hat in hand and say, oh, here, let me tell you about what I believe, right? They're not interested. They're interested in their own personal spiritual journey, and that actually causes, I think, maybe the cause of the Greeks to respect them, right? To say, hey, they take this stuff really seriously. So Onesicratus is like interested in their philosophical teachings, so he goes and visits them. He writes this account that's now lost, partially survives in secondary sources. And then what happens after that is you get a lot of spin and embellishment and ridiculous exaggerations over centuries and centuries that are still mostly attributed to classical sources. So there's a variety of classical sources that deal with the gymnosophists. I forget, one of them, is it Megasthenes? One of the ancient historians who's a Seleucid ambassador to India, he gets information about the gymnosophists from their Brahmanist rivals. And so the Brahmanists are saying they hate them and they're like nasty and awful. And so you get like a little bit about gymnosophists through them. But then they say, oh, there's this one guy, is it Dandimus? He's one of their teachers. He's okay. Most of them are assholes, but there's this one gymnosophist that we think is all right. And so that influences later European thinking about the gymnosophists. And then there are legends. So Pseudo-Callisthenes is Callisthenes is the guy who the Alexander romantic legends are attributed to. He's an ancient Greek historian. He obviously didn't actually write them, but he is the name that gets put on them as they evolve and change and get like new additions, like fake letters written between, the gymnosophist king and Alexander, right? They're like, do have like this series of correspondence and everything, and it's all made up. There was a fun Hellenistic world party game where you would play the part of a gymnosophist, and someone would ask you questions right? Like philosophical questions, like how, why do birds fly or whatever. I don't know specifically off the top of my head. And then you would role play a gymnosophist answering with your like extremely sophisticated Indian philosophy. And these party games got transcribed and then put into the Alexander legends on more than one occasion. Versions of that party game show up in the Talmud. They show up, they're attributed to Pseudo-Callisthenes. I think some of them show up in Plutarch. I think that they end up, indirectly they influence the discussion of this stuff in the Quran, right? Of Alexander the Great's interaction with the Indians. And so where I'm coming from is the medieval Alexander romances attributed to Pseudo-Callisthenes. We would have no way to know that there's any accurate information there. Like if you were just going by the text itself, you would say, this is complete and total baloney, malarkey. Now skip to the next one, and I'll show. So here's the undesigned coincidence. That this is all that. I know it's like a big deal, right? Here is Alexander the king meeting with the king of the gymnosophists. By the way, of course, they wouldn't be really king. These are all like later European anachronisms for showing the gymnosophist with a crown and everything.
Oops, sorry. What did I do?
Was that did you skip? No, go back. Yeah, there. That's where we're at. So this is showing the nude philosopher ascetics, the gymnosophists, talking to Alexander the Great. And this is in a Middle English manuscript illumination of one of those Alexander romances that I was talking about. This little artistic convention that we see, what do you notice, Derek, about the gymnosophists besides the fact that they have beards and the one
they look Greek. I mean, they look similar to Alexander in a way.
Well, yeah, that's because people didn't have the notion that people elsewhere dressed differently or looked differently. The artists assumed that people all over the world looked the same.
Well, they're naked. They're naked. That's the most obvious.
The naked. Okay, so the nudity is like the nude philosopher ascetic, the nude monks. That detail comes down, but that's pretty mundane. There's something a little more significant, and I'm sorry, I got a mini split in here. If it's buzzing, I apologize. What are they? They're not entirely naked. Look closely. What's on their bodies?
From what I can see, I mean, they have beards. They have hair.
What the green stuff?
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought that was something from the background or something. What is that? Oh, those are vines.
They're vines. They're not naked. They're naked, and they have forest vines wrapping around their limbs and body. And this is the undesigned coincidence. It's that detail. So you basically have a whole lot of bullshit that is not accurate information about ancient Indian religion in this text. But in this one little manuscript illumination, it shows forest vines wrapped around their nude bodies. That is an authentic early shramana tradition. It's not a tradition in terms of practice. You don't wear leaves as clothing, but it relates to the doctrine. Like I told you, the gymnosophists are very close to the Jains. Yeah. One of the most important Jain saints is a guy named Bahubali, who lived after this, by the way. So he's an early first millennium, mid first millennium. I forget precisely his dates of life. But go to the next slide. All over southern India, there are megalithic statues of Bahubali. There's several of them. This is one. And they are sites of Jain pilgrimage. So here is the great Jain saint Bahubali, and he is meditating in the forest with such incredible devotion that the forest does what? The forest grows around him and consumes him. He is so at one with the universe that the life as we know it of his place, it conjoins with him. He's got animals living in his armpits. You know what I mean? He's got, and so like I don't know if Tolkien was directly inspired by this when he came up with Radagast the Brown in, if you've seen the Hobbit movie where he's got like the birds in his hair and things like that. But that's similar idea, somebody who's so at one with nature that nature is at one with him. So the fact that in that medieval European manuscript, you have those little green vines on the naked guys means that there's some part of the lore that's getting passed down all the way from the beginning, right? That includes that accurate detail of a tradition associated with nude philosophers in the early shramana period. And why do I say it's likely that that is actually a retention of some accurate recollection rather than a later borrowing or later influence? Because this is an obscure detail outside of India, right? Missionary Buddhism is big in Central Asia, East Asia. Sure, Europeans eventually encounter Buddhism in various places, but Buddhism doesn't do nude asceticism. Buddhism doesn't have this teaching. Jainism never becomes a missionary religion. Jainism never goes out onto the Silk Road. It never becomes something that the Greeks are aware of. Its relationship to gymnosophism is like 500 BC. It goes back to that, so the fact that it branches from the same rootstock as the tradition that the European manuscript is describing. Okay?
Got it.
And that's pretty much where we're at with this. So I'm showing that I'm setting a very high bar here for undesigned coincidences. I think that you could find something in an ancient manuscript that is such a compelling coincidence that you'd say, wow, this means something historical, that there is a historical kernel there that we can extract and say, wow, and be impressed. But the reason why we know it is because of the lack of other connecting tissues here. It's the very fact that it occurs in isolation, in a sea of otherwise completely unrelated stuff that's just superficially connected by the name, the fact that the same characters are involved, right? But the story itself is so divergent from what actually happened. You would normally say there is very little historical information we can extract from this document that is meaningful in terms of the time that it's referring to. But this is an example of something where you say, oh, except for this. And so the coincidence means something in contrast to the material that is not accurate. If it was all accurate, then it would just be all accurate, if that makes sense. It's like, why would this undesigned coincidence matter if it was part of an otherwise entirely accurate story? It would just be a correct version, in that case. Whatever. Okay, I'm starting to ramble a little bit. The last slide I have is a slightly different topic. It's just pointing out that there were Buddhist texts that were translated into Christian terms and transmitted as Christian texts. And Barlam and Josaphat is the most famous one, where the Buddha actually gets turned into a Christian saint and is really, really popular in late medieval and early modern Europe. And this is a German woodcut showing the Buddha going out into the world, like right before he starts his religious mission, when he's still in his home palace. He's a prince, and he's going out and he sees the crippled man, the sick man, and that reveals to him the existence of suffering. So what I'm saying is that there are actual influences of Indian religion in medieval Europe at the time that come through a lot of different intermediate stages from Persia and Arabia, etc. But those influences are not about Jainism and not about early shramana practices, but the later contemporary forms that were the medieval versions of these religions, if that makes sense.
Wow. So we need to dive into this for a moment. Are we done here?
Yeah, so that's my presentation, and as far as I'm concerned, I think I'm just checking the time real quick. I've got 20 minutes easily if you want to ask me anything you want or just chat about.
Absolutely. Okay, so Joe, let me ask you this. We talk about this weird conundrum of a viney covering person that goes back to like a really early form of Jainism that shouldn't necessarily be in this place. I, being a detective who's critical, want to know how the hell did this end up in this, right? So what are your guesses? Because this is an interesting point.
So I think that there's a number of different ways you could approach it, but I think the most inherently plausible one is to remember is that we always should assume that there are twice as many sources that used to exist than do exist now.
Right.
And that for every surviving source, there might have been 2 or 3 equally important texts that haven't survived. And so if we think of this, if we think of every ancient text that makes it to the present as a glimmer, like a pixel in an otherwise more complete picture. I mean, look at the recent Oxyrhynchus manuscripts, you know, or is it Ridlin's manuscript? There's like several fragmentary early gospels that are related to the synoptic traditions and Thomas, and that are not represented in any surviving documents. And the fact that when you go through document dumps in Egypt, you periodically find a new gospel that isn't at all related to the other ones, or I mean, I shouldn't say that isn't identical to the other ones. It's not Matthew, it's not Luke. It shares common features with both, but it's like, you know, there's enough of them now that we have to say, wow, the literatures that survive are just a piece of a larger body of text. So whatever we're seeing there must be related to something we don't know about. And, you know, we have to be content with not knowing about that. Being comfortable with uncertainty is like the first thing that you have to do if you're interested in ancient history and archaeology. Right. And that is to say that we're looking for glimmers of something that is hidden from us and will never be visible from us. I
like this what you're describing here. I tend to think that as well. Like maybe there's something we aren't aware of, and we've probably lost way more than we preserved on a lot of this stuff. But the other thing I wanted to ask you that I think is interesting about that is, suppose we don't know exactly, but maybe it's more popular, or maybe we are missing something in history. We just don't see how this got into this legend, I'll call it, a rolling legend, which I personally also look at the New Testament, the Gospels, and call them rolling legends. You see a continuation of this kind of material in the genre, and the undesigned coincidence folks, they have these certain boundaries and walls. So when you go into the non-canonical material and you find some undesigned coincidences, as long as it lines up with the canonical material, that's somehow a memory that's found itself into the legendary stuff. So let's compare this to what you just described.
So I'm somebody who tends to be more sympathetic to like the people who believe that there's at least a portion of the gospel. So let's talk about the gospel according to Thomas.
Okay.
The Gospel according to Thomas is an example of a non-canonical source that's got a very strong historical relationship to the canonical sources, that you could certainly do your undesigned coincidences kinds of arguments, comparing the logia in Thomas with the corresponding sayings in the synoptic tradition. So someone like Mark Goodacre has done this, and he argues that Thomas is a late derivative, like mashup of the synoptics. So somebody with some Gnosticizing community took the traditions in the synoptics and kind of blended them into a new thing framed in a new way. And that's where Thomas comes from. And I would say, oh, well, but hold on. There are occasions when individual logia in Thomas appear to be possibly more primitive, more like earlier versions of the same idea than the ones that survive. Right. And that could have a lot of different explanations. It could be, as Goodacre would argue, that they're being developed in a different direction and someone is, retconning or, coming up with a new spin that provides a bigger picture to something that maybe didn't make a whole lot of sense in the original version, right? And or someone's doing a better repackaging of the same idea. Or it could be that the other ones have winnowed it down, because the earliest core of the synoptic tradition has got to be Mark, right? And Mark is very fragmentary. Mm-hmm. We don't know the evidence for early forms of Mark are piecemeal, and as a result of the fact that we don't have, but I don't know, a fraction of the very early text of Mark that we have of all the other synoptics means we don't necessarily know the original form.
Right.
Maybe Thomas is preserving a version of the Mark account that the surviving versions don't have. So unless you were to get like a really early and very complete manuscript of Mark, that you don't have a very good way of saying which came first, the chicken or the egg, right? There are all these different interdependencies between the canonical and the non-canonical traditions are mysterious unless you have the ur-text behind all of them, which could be different than any of them for all we know. Again, looking at those new similar gospels to the synoptics that have come up with pieces here and there, we don't have any way of saying which one's the first version. So yeah, I would say that the unplanned coincidence argument could easily be used to say prop up Thomas as the first version and these other ones, or say that Thomas is equally reliable. Why wouldn't the divinely ordained canonical versions preserve the true thing that's conveyed in Thomas via undesigned coincidence? So I agree with that. I agree with that the echoes of this thinking have ramifications in any if you move outside the canon that could be uncomfortable for Orthodox thinkers.
Now, as far as Jainism and the nudity with the vines wrapping around, as this is a unique coincidence and it appears in this material, as far as we're aware, it looks like a coincidence because we don't know. But the point I wanted to get at is this goes back to a historical memory based on legends that you will become one with the forest or with the trees or with nature. Is there an account that like somewhere in early Jainism that there's like a miracle where the person really did become one with nature?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what I'm saying. I forget when Bahubali is supposed to have lived. Right. You can look him up on Wikipedia. I mean, I apologize, I don't have all these details, but I'm pretty sure as a historical saint, he's sometime in the common era. Actually, hold on. I'm going to reduce my screen and I'm just going to check it now so I don't make a mistake.
Okay. I don't blame you.
Okay, so he is a legendary figure in Jainism. Well, okay, so yeah, because he's a legendary figure, we don't know. He doesn't, his historicity, his like particular period when he would have lived is not, that's why I couldn't remember it, because it's not like a thing. But the sect that regards him as important rises up in the early to middle part of the medieval period, right? So I mean that the developed form of Southern Indian Jainism, which we associate with like the Digambara sect of Jainism, which is the one that maintains nudity for male monks to this day. So like in the distant past, Jainism split into the ones that wear clothes and the ones that don't wear clothes, and the ones that don't wear clothes in like the 900s started making these giant statues of Bahubali, who's a legendary figure. I remember because the period of origins is like before the stuff was written down. So I am and by the way, Jainism woefully understudied in the Western Academy. It is something that has, for as important as it is in the history of religions in India, is something that Western academics and Asian studies scholars in Western academic settings have not studied enough. So I don't want to sit here and pretend to be an expert. Right. I studied it as in my master's degree in London. It was a topic because in dealing with Buddhist origins, you have to deal with Jain origins because they're related. But it is something where there are very few like majorly impressive specialists doing work on this stuff. And so, yeah.
Okay, so one more thing, just tying it back to the Gospels, as we said up front, is in comparing your study of Eastern religions and then looking at Christianity and the people who are suggesting undesigned coincidences, how does it sound to you as a scholar who's never read her works? Lydia McGrew is the
I've heard them discussed. But
you've heard it discussed, but you never read her books or anything, but you have the idea based on the conversations that have come up. And how does it sound when someone tries to say, hey, we have these 4 gospels and there are these undesigned coincidences, and one it says the grass is green and the other one talks about it's Passover, which would have been summer, or whatever like there's some
right
interlocking ideas amongst this literature. This somehow in their mind, and they'll argue that it crisscrosses. And I recently had a discussion with an apologist on my channel where they were seeing stuff that I just did not see. Questions that,
Is that an example? Did you cite a real example where they say the color of the grass?
They cite that
correlates with the fact that there is a particular seasonal ritual corresponding to the same point in the narrative in two different versions of the thing.
That's something they cite.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's not doing it for me. No.
Right.
I'm not getting there because it's true that grass can be colors other than green. Like I have parts of my yard that have brown grass, and parts of my yard have green grass, and that's and there's less brown and more green in certain seasons. But I don't see that. I think you can't nail that's too big of a window there. If you're just talking about something at that level. Now there might be, if I would have to go read the McGrew's book carefully, there might be more sophisticated examples that are more precise in their way that but the more precise they are, the less ambiguous they are, the less likely they are to be undesigned. So the green grass thing, you could say, oh, well, that's no way were they comparing notes there. That's just a random coincidence. That's undesigned, right? You could sort of, because it's so vague, it's a little more plausible as a fluke, or but it also doesn't inform you very much, because all it's doing is saying that there's only 4 seasons in a year, and you guess randomly which season it is, you're going to be right at least 25% of the time. That's not it's not enough to prove that it's historically reliable, because 2 different texts are both set in winter or spring. Right. That's like there's stories set in spring all around the world. That doesn't mean that they're so if you move on to something that's more detailed, like a coincidence where the details really interlock tightly in a way that's unambiguous, then you have to say, well, these authors knew each other's work, and the undesigned part becomes impossible to prove. It looks very designed, because that's how puzzle pieces fit together. Pieces fit together by design.
Now, what do you do with the contrary or contradictory evidence in that kind of situation? They'll go, well, you guys keep saying that they're interlocking, but they contradict. How you can't have both? That's the argument.
But they're interlocking and they contradict. That's true with all historical sources. All ancient historical sources interlock and contradict. If they have to interlock, if they're to speak together. If they don't interlock, they can't have any kind of, they can't generate an interpretation they harmonize in certain ways, and they create discord in certain ways. There's a reason why these authors wrote different accounts.
Right.
If they didn't have reasons to contradict each other, Matthew would never have changed up Mark. I mean, there are obvious ways that Luke is doing Luke's thing in contrast to what, Luke is staking his claims against those of Mark's. And when he does that, he is being very deliberate, and he is doing it with a purpose. He's not writing the same text again.
Right.
So the fact that in certain details he is creating harmonic convergence or puzzle pieces that interact, and in other details he's contradicting him, that is absolutely normal. For someone to say that is disingenuous or hypocritical, they're not doing responsible historiography, where it is the duty of every interpreter to tease apart those questions and to say where are these details interlocking and why, where are they contradicting and why. And it can't just be because they're all reliable, or because they have a single common truth. There's a different truth that's being aimed for by different authors. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother to reinvent the wheel, right? Even if they're sharing half of their beliefs.
Thank you so much. I'm not going to live naked in public for the rest of my life, but it does pique my curiosity to want to investigate Eastern religions more to understand their origins.
Ancient atheism is an interesting topic. There's a lot of there were lots of medieval Indian Buddhists were atheists. Now Buddhism doesn't have to be atheist. Buddhists can be theistic or non-theistic depending on their individual. Like Buddhism is very broad. There were major atheistic Buddhist schools in medieval India that were involved in religious debates and stuff like that. So if people on your channel are interested in the history of atheism, it is one of the this Indian religion and the history of atheism are both topics that would be interesting to your audience. So.
What I really enjoyed too is how you kind of painted a picture that shows the human experience when it comes to the beginning of religions and their development and their continued, I'm going to call them, religions are rolling religions. Even the most fundamentalist versions of them eventually conform to new ideas and have to adapt. And so I think it's really interesting using kind of a heuristic comparison and looking at the Eastern religions, looking at these Judeo-Christian religions and seeing so much overlap in how people who are probably not communicating till later naturally as humans do things similar. It's like a common thing that we do. And it makes me look and go, I see Christianity looks very much in many ways, even though there's philosophical differences, they have asceticism in common, which might stem from, like you said, back in the 3rd, 4th century when Hellenism comes in and there's some brushing of shoulders into the Greek world that we now see in Christianity and the various philosophies that come down and influence Christians. But it's still, even then, that would be so distant. There's so much overlap in similar ways and differences, but it looks very human, is what I'm saying. The whole enterprise looks very human. And so when people try to bolster Christianity on this pedestal, the apologists, they are doing so when they're really not aware and looking at the whole scope of religion as a human thing. That's how I see it.
It's a real pleasure to be here again today. And I'll come back and talk with you anytime about whatever you want to talk about. So.
Joe, thank you so much. Everybody, go check out the links in the description. You can go and check out his article. And until next time.
Oh, it's not my article. It's Lavalley's article, but it's related to this topic. So yeah.
We should link something though for
me. I have an article that I wrote that deals with East-West connections and the history of medieval Christianity. So that's probably the closest to this topic. So I'll provide Derek with the link to my work too.
Check it out. Thank you so much. And never forget, we are MythVision.